Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let me welcome you on behalf of Ilia State University to this extremely timely and important international conference, which is organized by the joint efforts of Foreign Policy Research Institute and Ilia State University. As you all are aware of, our conference will be focused on a very important part of the world, that is the Black Sea region. And during these 2 days, we will have the opportunity to hear expert opinion and delve deeper into the challenges and the opportunities which the region faces today. Why the Black Sea region is so important in the context of contemporary world politics, I believe, doesn't need much explanation, especially to this audience. But despite this, I would like to draw your attention to one important aspect, which I believe emphasizes that the magnitude of the processes which are taking place today in the region far exceed the regional borders and regional dimension and acquire kind of the global scope. For this, we need to look a little bit into our recent history. The end of the Cold War created the favorable conditions for the spread of the ideas of liberal democracy, the spread of the ideas of market capitalism, and also it opened space for strengthening the cooperation among states, among the nation states. The new consensus has started to emerge about the nature and the logic of interstate relations, and which were based on several important pillars or assumptions, and I believe that 3 of them have been the most important. The first, this was the belief in progress, the belief that the change is possible, that the international system can move forward, that the relations between nation states can be transformed from conflictual into cooperative, into the cooperation, and the practices and the norms which the interstate relations has experienced in the past are not the norm of international politics, and that they can be changed. The second important pillar of this consensus has been believed that international politics is not the zero-sum game, that the states and international system can achieve much more and much bigger benefits by cooperation and collaboration rather than by conflict and competition. And the third, which I believe is really most important in the context of the Black Sea region, has been the agreement between among the international community that the states, despite differences in their material power capabilities, all exercise the same rights, and they are equal when it comes to their political role and their kind of the standing in front of the international law. And these pillars and some other pillars as well created the foundation for the so-called rules-based international order, which defined and which created the solid conditions for the transformation of international politics from conflictual into cooperative and a cooperative kind of the endeavor. But unfortunately, for us, I believe that the Black Sea represents the region where this consensus is the most challenged at the moment. And the Russian Federation, its extensive reliance on the use of the hard military power, its rough interference into the domestic affairs of the neighboring countries, including this country. Also, occupation of Georgia in 2008, and I would like to remind you that the first kind of the materialization of Russia's military power used abroad started in Georgia in 2008, and now totally illegal and illegitimate campaign against Ukraine demonstrates that this so-called rules-based international order is only partially and weakly accepted and institutionalized in this part of the world and in the Black Sea region. The Russian Federation continues to see world politics and international politics through the prism of the zero-sum game, and it attempts with all means available to delegitimize the progress that the international community has achieved in the recent decades. Kremlin proposes to revive the legitimacy for the concepts such as the spheres of influence, the spheres of privileged interests, so-called buffer zones. And it attempts to limit not only the foreign policy freedom of the smaller countries in the region, but also to threaten their very existence, I would say, to threaten their perspectives of their modernization and democratization. In such a vulnerable context, I believe that the importance of the Black Sea region far exceeds regional dimension. Today, talking in symbolically, the region is the space where past and the future are in confrontation, where the principles of power politics and the principles of rules-based international order are in confrontation with each other, and the results of this confrontation will inevitably affect not only the fate of the countries and the societies of this region, but I believe the whole architecture of the global international security order. So that is why our conference today is so important. So this is now, in my perspective, this is not only an interesting intellectual exercise, but this is also very practical. It has very practical mission to delve deeper into the real world problems, day-to-day challenges, and even help to identify some solutions which exist to the challenges which exist in the region. With this, let me conclude my remark with some words of the thanks. First of all, of course, my thanks goes to the Foreign Policy Research Institute and its wonderful team, and particular thanks goes to Director of Eurasia program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, Maia Otarashvili. Thank you, Maia, for reaching us and for giving us this opportunity of cooperating with you within this important international conference. Also, I would like to thank Mr. David Sikharulidze, because David initiated this discussion between us and Foreign Policy Research Institute. Of course, big thanks goes to all our panelists and moderators, myself included, and of course to the wider audience, our guests, and of course to our wonderful students who will be with us during these 2 days. With that, I would like to wish you the successful 2-day conference, and let me now give floor to the member of the Board of Trustees of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, to the Lee Woolley. Please. Thank you.
Thank you, Georgi. I appreciate that. Wonderful comments. I'm here representing the board of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Again, my name is Lee Woolley. I'm probably one of the more non-traditional folks you're going to meet in the room here. I'm a banker, right? Not only am I a banker, not involved specifically in the field of foreign affairs, but I was recently hired by a crypto company to acquire a bank in the United States and become one of the first digitally oriented banks in the US. So very different background from many of you in the room. But I represent the board of trustees of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, which is just a phenomenal organization. For those of you who don't know FPRI or don't know it well, it's a Philadelphia-based think tank that really focuses on geopolitics within the lens of geography and culture and history. Great organization. FPRI really, the reason I joined this organization in a leadership role on the board is because it truly does affect change. So as Georgi just mentioned, this isn't just an academic or theoretical discussion about security issues in the Black Sea. It's a real practical discussion, and FPRI has the ability to educate and influence important decision makers in the United States, and I hope you enjoy today's program as much as I enjoy working with FPRI and the many folks that you're going to meet this afternoon or this morning. Specifically, I'd like to thank Maia. I've known her now for probably 7 or 8 years. She's terrific. Bob Hamilton is also going to be on the panel right up front here. The two of them really coordinated that from FPRI's perspective. And then we also have a couple other employees from FPRI here. We have Leah, who's holding the camera over there, and then we have Natalia in the back, if you have any questions for her as well. So thank you very much for joining us today. We appreciate your attendance.
Thank you, Georgi. Thank you, Lee. Hello, my name is Maia Otarashvili. I'm the director of the Eurasia program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and I'm here to kick things off. First of all, again, thank you so much to Ilia, to the students, to the volunteers who have been helping us pull this conference together, but my most sincere thanks to Georgi Gvosdev for giving us this space, for sharing your lovely venue with us, and also for live streaming our event online, which is a great reminder. So this event is being recorded, but also live streamed. So anything you say will be recorded and will be live streamed, so we have a live audience at the moment. Just keep that in mind, please. We started the Black Sea Initiative at FPRI in 2016, and really there were two main motivating factors. One was the idea that we at FPRI believe that the Black Sea region matters, and it's very important for US foreign policy and strategic interests. Two, we wanted to amplify the voices from the region, and we wanted to bring those voices to the English-speaking world. We felt and still feel that there is not enough of that. There are excellent experts, many generations of young, bright people in Georgia, in Moldova, in Ukraine, and I think the English-speaking world and the Western audiences, policymakers, policy influencers, need to hear your voices more. So FPRI would really like to help make a contribution to that. So I hope that we can continue working with the university and be a resource to you guys. Before I go into some of the logistics of today, let me just really quickly make sure that I thank everyone I need to thank. So Data Sikharulidze, Batu Kutelia, Georgi again, Georgi Otarashvili in the back, Natalia Kopitnik and Leah Pedro from FPRI. Lee Woolley for being here and representing the leadership of our organization, and also Chris Miller, who could not be here with us today. He's the founding director of the Eurasia program. This was his idea 3 years ago, and it's been 3 years in the making. So although Chris is not here today, we are all very grateful to him, and this would not have been possible without him. So just really quickly, some housekeeping. We have hour-and-a-half-long panels, and there are really no formal breaks between panels because we want to make most of our time together. But there is coffee is going to be served outside, so everyone can kind of come and go, but very quietly, please, so we don't disturb the very important discussions that are going to be going on here. We will break for lunch at 1 p.m. from 1 to 2, and then we'll come back and the conference will go on until 5 p.m. We will leave plenty of time for audience Q&A. The last 30 minutes of each panel will be set aside for Q&A. There will be microphones that will come around, so please be active. Please ask questions. We want to make sure that our speakers engage with the audience as much as possible. But I do ask that we keep our questions as brief and succinct as we possibly can. Lastly, we're at a university. I know these are very hard and tension-filled times, but I just want to remind everyone that, especially at FPRI, and I know at this university, we respect academic freedom, intellectual freedom, but we also have respectful discussions and debates. So I just want to encourage everyone to speak freely, not be afraid to disagree. Feel free to have debates and disagreements, but let's make sure that it is respectful. And with that, let me go into panel one, which I have the honor of moderating. So I will very quickly introduce panel one speakers, but as you came in, you had the agenda documents available, but also very thick bio documents where you can see the credentials of all of our speakers and their backgrounds. So we won't take too much time introducing everyone in great detail, but in this case, it's a very easy job because every one of these panel one speakers is an FPRI senior fellow. But we'll start with Bob Hamilton, who is the head of Eurasia research at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. He runs the Eurasia program with me, and this conference would not have been possible without him. So Bob, please come up. Then we have Gvosdev, who is also a senior fellow at FPRI and the editor of our scholarly journal Orbis, which many of you you might already know about, and if not, please talk to Nick about it later if you'd like to publish your papers in FPRI's peer-reviewed journal. Then we have Rick Landgraf, who is a brand new senior fellow at FPRI, and we're delighted to have him with us. And then we have Batu Kutelia, who is giving an interview as we speak, so he will be joining us in just a minute. Batu is also a senior fellow at FPRI. So with that, I'm just going to take a seat, but turn it over to Bob. Our first panel is all about, I guess, the number one question that's on everyone's mind, which is, what is NATO doing in the Black Sea region? What's NATO's role in this region? What should it be? What are the prospects of NATO enlargement? And of course, how is the atrocious Russian war in Ukraine shaping NATO's future in the Black Sea region and beyond? So Bob, let's start with you, and then we'll go to Nick, Rick, and then Batu. Thank you so much. So I declare this conference open.
So thank you, Maia, and again, thanks to our hosts at Ilia University for the great support and for the use of their venue. You're going to hear this 3 times from panelists. I'm going to say that my remarks are my own and do not reflect the policy or position of the U.S. Army War College, the U.S. Army, or the Department of Defense. So you're going to hear different versions of that from Nick and Rick as well. I'll start by saying NATO was slow to recognize the importance of the Black Sea region. It's been a long time coming. So in the U.S. Congress, there's floating around a law called the Black Sea Security Act that if and when it will be passed probably in some form this year. Parts of it are already in the National Defense Authorization Act, but it will require the U.S. administration, the Biden administration, the National Security Council to produce a policy and a strategy for the Black Sea region within 360 days of the law's passage. And the strategy, Congress has actually written into the law the specific pieces of the strategy that they want the administration to focus on. And actually this conference is partially structured around how that strategy would be written. And the lines of effort or the areas of focus are security, strategic connectivity, and democratic resilience. So on this panel, we're talking about NATO in the Black Sea. I'll say NATO was also slow to recognize the importance of the region, and frankly, slow to recognize the fact that the Black Sea region is the region in which Russia has chosen to challenge the rules-based order that Georgi talked about in his opening remarks. So all uses of Russian military power in this century have occurred in the Black Sea or Eastern Mediterranean region. So we had the 2008 invasion of Georgia, 2014 invasion of Ukraine, 2015 intervention in Syria, and then the re-invasion, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Sort of curiously, NATO responded it frankly didn't respond to the 2008 invasion of Georgia in any significant way. It responded to the 2014 invasion of Ukraine by deciding that the Russian threat needed to be met in the Baltics, which in some way makes sense. The Baltics were all 3 NATO members covered by Article 5. A Russian intervention or invasion of the Baltics would trigger Article 5, and they were incapable of defending themselves. And so if you look at the slide here, this is the NATO eastern flank presence as it's developed over time. But again, it was after 2014, what we call the tailored force presence battle groups, the battle groups in Poland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were stood up, but no battle groups were stood up here in the Black Sea region. We now have them in Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, but these were not formed until the 2022 re-invasion of Ukraine. So my argument is that's what caused NATO to take the Russian threat to the rules-based order, the Russian attempts to destabilize this region seriously, and that's where NATO and the U.S. Decided that we had interests important enough in this region that were worth defending by the deployment of military power. So if you could go to the next slide, please, or I guess I can. Let's see. The mouse is over here, yeah.
We also have a clip. Maybe that would help.
There we go. Thank you. So what NATO has done, the latest thing NATO has done is pledged to upgrade all of its battle groups, which are essentially at battalion level strength, which is a few hundred to 1,000 or so people, to brigade level strength. At the 2022 summit, NATO took this decision. It's going to take time, but it will essentially triple the NATO combat power in the Black Sea and the Baltic region. The first one of these that's going to happen is Germany and Lithuania concluded a bilateral agreement a little while ago for a German brigade to deploy to Lithuania. That's in the process of happening now, but that will happen in all of the other 7 tailored force presence countries on the eastern flank. So NATO's presence in the north and the south is different because the threat in the north and the south is different. In the north, the threat is ground-centric with air support. The threat is a Russian invasion of the Baltic states, which are small, and would be, the thinking before Ukraine is they would be fairly easy for Russia to accomplish a fait accompli, right? To quickly drive through the Baltics, to cut the Suwalki corridor, which would prevent NATO from reinforcing the Baltics from Poland, and present NATO with a fait accompli. I think that thinking has changed based on the Russian incapacity we've seen in Ukraine, and the damage the Russian military has suffered. But nevertheless, it's still, the threat is still a conventional ground threat in the north. Down here in the Black Sea region, where Turkey, Romania, Bulgaria are members, and Georgia and Ukraine are NATO aspirants and partners, the threat is different. It's predominantly an air and maritime threat, and so NATO is meeting it in a different way with a lot of air defense assets and maritime domain awareness, maritime security assets, and not as much in terms of boots on the ground forces. So.
You can actually use the.
Ah, okay, great, thank you. Mm-hmm.
Did it work?
No.
Yeah, because there's no. No worries.
So the next slide shows the threat down here, the Russian, what we call the A2AD threat, the anti-access aerial denial threat. And I won't spend much time on this slide, but this slide makes the point Crimea is critical to this threat. As long as Russia has its military presence in Crimea, it can essentially shut off or complicate NATO air and maritime operations in the Black Sea because of the reach of its air defense and its anti-ship assets. So okay, you can go ahead to the next one, that's fine.
Do you want to try to click this one?
Yeah. Okay, so what do we know and what do we not know about operations in the Black Sea for NATO? We know that the Montreux Convention is a limiting factor in terms of warships that are not of the region being in the region, right? So the Montreux Convention, which Turkey enforces, essentially says that only Black Sea littoral states are allowed unimpeded access, maritime access to the Black Sea. It's a double-edged sword for NATO. It does keep NATO ships out of the Black Sea in certain contexts, but the Turks have also kept Russian warships out of the Black Sea since the war in Ukraine started. Russian warships that are not based in the Black Sea, Turkey has prevented them from moving to the Black Sea. Russian naval dominance is a fact. Even the loss of the Moskva and the loss of other naval assets they've suffered in Ukraine, it doesn't really change the fact that Russia is the dominant naval power on the Black Sea. That's something that NATO will have to grapple with if it ever comes to war in the Black Sea. The Russian A2AD threat that the previous slide depicted, Turkey's role is a variable. Turkey is a NATO ally. It's one of the most important NATO allies, but frankly, from at least the US perspective, it's been a bit of an unpredictable ally over the last several years, and its relationship with Russia has been a factor that we've had to deal with, and we've not always been certain how Turkey is going to react to critical security questions in the region. And then, of course, the outcome of the war in Ukraine. Russia's military has suffered badly and will probably continue to suffer badly. If you talk to, I was recently with my students in the Baltic republics, in Latvia and Lithuania, and the perspective there is 3 to 5 years and Russia will have rebuilt all the military capability that it's lost in Ukraine and will present a bigger and more serious threat than it did in February of 2022. So that's a perspective of some of the frontline NATO states. And then finally, we'll talk about this more. What's Ukraine's status with NATO? The Vilnius summit is coming up next month. The U.S. has been fairly clear that it doesn't see an invitation, a direct path to NATO coming out of that summit. Other allies, especially frontline states, the Baltics, Poland, disagree fairly strongly, believe Ukraine has made a case for NATO in terms of both its democratic credentials. Clearly, it's made a case that it will be a military asset, not a liability to NATO. So we'll see what happens at the summit, but it does not look like Ukraine is going to get a direct invitation for membership. So I'll stop there, turn it over to Nick, and happy to take your questions.
Oh, we had to change the slides to next.
All right, while the slides are coming up for my presentation, echoing as Bob said, these are going to be my own opinions, not speaking for any organization, and certainly cannot commit governments to any of these proposals, but wanted to make some of these discussions as we move forward. And I wanted to echo something that Georgi started us with, which is, in this region of the world, we don't have to explain the importance of the region to an audience here. But what is important is that, belatedly, the importance of this region to other major actors in the world is becoming much more important. And it is a case of perhaps better late than never. Certainly when he was commanding naval forces, Admiral Fogo was very much someone saying that NATO, the Western Alliance, needed to pay a lot more attention to the greater Black Sea region. But this change is occurring, and as Bob has noted in his opening remarks, the importance of finally of drivers, policy drivers, the U.S. Congress already in the National Defense Authorization Act, and then through other pending legislation, to call for the United States, for instance, to conceptualize its approach to the Black Sea region as the Black Sea region, not as an appendage to some other part of the world. This follows on efforts that were undertaken in the last decade to conceptualize the Arctic. So my sense is that these new strategic documents are going to do for the Black Sea region what the Arctic strategies that the United States elucidated over the last decade have done, although I will momentarily get to some caveats that I have about that. How do I? Yeah, so go ahead and take me through. Again, why are other players in the world, in Europe, in the United States, but also in the global South and East, paying a lot more attention to the Black Sea region? Because of the perception that this is now going to become one of the critical keystone interconnectors in the world. My colleague Damian Kurnovich is going to talk more in his panel about the middle corridor, that as the northern pathway through Russia is sanctioned, as the southern pathway through Iran has sanctions on it, you're going to see a need for unimpeded access between the two great global engines of the world economy, the Euro-Atlantic Basin and the Indo-Pacific Basin, and this interconnects in this middle point. One of the things as well is that this northern, or this middle corridor, is part of a larger corridor that Mohammed Solomon has dubbed the Indo-Abrahamic corridor. So that really what is going to be driving global politics, global economics in the next 20 to 25 years is not just simply the rise of China, not just simply the Euro-Atlantic economic partnership, which between the two of them provide the bulk of global gross domestic product, but is this belt of countries, starting with Indonesia and India, working its way through to Egypt, the Gulf, Israel, and then going north into Europe through that corridor. And of course, the Black Sea is another arm of this Indo-Abrahamic corridor that is going to be critical. So you're going to see this greater degree of attention. Just briefly, again, and more for people from outside the region, and I think why people have paid attention to this. We go ahead with the next slide. Just briefly, I think this is what has attracted so much of the attention in the last year to the importance of the Black Sea region when it became clear that global food security rests on access to the Black Sea. So this is the UN grain shipping routes and the realization that without having a free flow, or at least a managed flow of foodstuffs through the Black Sea, you increase food insecurity in many parts of the world. And again, was this a wake-up call, particularly in places like Washington? Because people remember that the last time you had great convulsions, particularly in the Middle East, the Arab Spring, it was directly related to food prices and food insecurity. You would not have had the Arab Spring starting in 2010 in Egypt had bread prices not quadrupled in the months prior to the uprising in Tahrir Square. So the sense that food insecurity is something that is directly connected to Black Sea security. This was one of these wake-up call moments around the world, that the Black Sea is not a sideshow, is not a peripheral region, but is critical to that. Next slide. This, right before I came here, the 25th of June, this is your snapshot of maritime traffic in the Black Sea and in the littoral and the riverine areas. And of course, you can see where traffic is occurring. You can see where traffic is not occurring. What ports, where ships are coming through, where the transponders are on. But again, pointing to the Black Sea, this interconnection, the maritime interconnections, not just simply the Black Sea itself, but its connector to the larger Mediterranean, and again from that to this larger Indo-Abrahamic corridor. A little bit on that map you can see also from the Caspian, because we should not neglect that the Caspian is part of this process as well, that these two seas, these two maritime realms are interconnected, and that this is an important part of the lifeblood of the global economy. Go to the next slide. And then finally, this is giving you a sense of, so that was a snapshot of the transponders. This gives you a sense of the density of the maritime traffic, where it's going, where it's flowing from. And again, why this is critical for Ukraine is that for all the talk about Ukraine perhaps diverting some of its exports by rail, by truck, either to Constanța in Romania or to go to access the Baltic ports through Poland, the reality is that Ukraine is a Black Sea country. Its future is intimately tied to its access to the Black Sea. And the Ukraine question cannot be separated from these larger questions of the security architecture for the Black Sea region. Where I think we've seen over the last year, unfortunately, or not unfortunately, this has been an issue, is I think people have framed the Ukraine question largely in terms of Ukraine as a land barrier to Central Europe, which neglects or it takes away from the focus. So it's a horizontal thinking, and we have to keep thinking of Ukraine vertically, which is that it is integrated and is part of this greater Black Sea region. Right, next slide. Having said all of that, though, and this is where perhaps a reality check or a bit more realism about how Washington actually works. So on the one hand, yes, the United States Congress wants a Black Sea strategy, but the United States Congress asks for lots of strategy documents. We have strategies for everything now. We have strategies for how we're going to preserve the bee population, and the Department of Defense has to show how it will enhance the bee population on military bases. So yes, it's good that there's going to be a strategy. The question is, how is this going to be fitted into prioritization? And this is where I think we need a degree of realism. The Black Sea is an important region. It is not necessarily a vital region to every member of NATO or to every major player. Important, but not vital. The problem with some of these strategy documents is they make it seem as everything is vital, and if everything is vital, then nothing is, and then you often end up with an approach that is aspirational and doesn't deliver on hard commitments. We have some other realities, and Bob, you've already started, and I think this has to be part of the discussion. There's a unique legal framework for the maritime region of the Black Sea, which cannot just be dispensed with at the wave of a hand. Glad, Bob, you showed the A2AD map for Russia's capabilities, that Russia has, this is home waters. Russia has home field advantage. It has significant area denial, access denial capabilities that it is able to use. But of course, which NATO and NATO aspirant countries can develop as well, and perhaps you can develop a balance. The other realities, and this has to be part of the discussion, is that because this has not been a priority region for the alliance, has not been a priority region in terms of diplomacy, either because the alliance for a period of time focused on its southern periphery across the Mediterranean, and then, in my opinion, over-focused on the Baltic region in the last decade. This has led governments, both non-NATO or NATO aspirant and then NATO allies, to feel that they need to cut their own arrangement, their own deals with Russia, because they don't necessarily feel that the alliance as the alliance is going to be as involved. We can, of course, note that Turkey has been a key part of this for very good reasons of Turkish national and economic security. That it feels that it has equities in the Black Sea that certainly Western Europeans and even to some extent the United States may not understand or support. And so you have the problem, and then to a lesser extent, we saw this a few years ago, the attempt to create a NATO flotilla for the Black Sea. Was not simply that the Russians objected, it's that NATO countries themselves that were littoral states in the Black Sea also had issues, questions, and concerns about how that would operate. The other problem that we have to focus on, and that this is still a problem for the member states of the alliance, is we often cannot focus simultaneously on many regions. And NATO as an alliance has a lot of territory to cover, has a lot of regions it has to deal with, and regions that are separated and that it's hard to move from. You can't easily pivot from the Arctic to the Baltic to the Black Sea. These things don't move on a dime. And the problem has been in Western military procurement over the last 2 decades. In the words of Eric Schmidt of Google, the West has tended to go for exquisite and expensive systems which are not numerous and which can only be in one place at a time, as opposed to mass, cheap, attritable, easily deployable, and also where you're not worried about losing them because they're not expensive. Right? So that the perennial US issue is when an aircraft carrier is $1 billion plus, you don't want to lose it. And if you don't want to lose it, you don't necessarily want to put it in a frontline position where it might be exposed to damage, as opposed to what some of the new technologies offer you. And then finally, it's not just simply rhetoric. This is going to be, I think, a subtext of the Vilnius summit, is the United States is pivoting to the Indo-Pacific. Part of the Biden administration's strategy on Ukraine had a very important temporal assumption that has not worked out, which was the assumption among many in the Biden team was that Ukraine, the active invasion of Ukraine would have been thwarted and ended by the end of last year. This was the basis for a lot of the sanctions. This was the basis for a lot of the initial aid. The United States assumed essentially that Ukraine would be wrapped up by now, and then the pivot to, continued pivot to Asia Pacific would proceed. That's not happening, and therefore and we'll talk about this in tomorrow's panels, what is the reality if the Russia-Ukraine, Russian invasion of Ukraine actually can last a lot longer? That this can actually go on not for days, weeks, months, but even years. And at some point, the United States, there's significant growing pressure within the U.S. strategic community to say, the United States has done what it can, it will continue to support, but other players will have to do more in this region, and if they don't, the United States cannot backstop it because it will have to continue its shift to the Asia Pacific. So that is part of this. So what does this lead, and this is sort of my thinking to close out, what is a realistic, achievable strategy for the Black Sea region? If we can go to the last slide. And this was some work that was done at the Naval War College a few years ago, the notion of a partnership for prickliness. And that is that This was, of course, prior to the Russian restart of active operations in Ukraine. But even there, we saw the beginnings of this strategy bearing results, which is to build up the resilience and capacity of all Black Sea countries to be able to raise the costs for any type of invasion or armed activity. It is therefore focused on scalable, modular, and distributed capabilities, which, going back to Eric Schmidt's ideas, are inexpensive, easily to produce, to maintain, does not require gold-plated production in the United States and then a long supply chain to ship it. You want to develop systems that can be deployed locally, that can be integrated with each other, that can ratchet up or ratchet down based particularly on what Russia does or does not do. This is sometimes is a notion of what's known as porcupine defense, that hence the idea of a partnership for prickliness, and what are some of the quills. So if a porcupine is able to disincentivize a predator from attacking because the predator knows it will be full of pointy quills, what are some of these that we're looking at? And this is, again, where we can begin to harness fourth industrial revolution technologies. Part of the problem, and I think this will come out in Vilnius again, is that NATO is still stuck, if I may say, in a late 20th century conception of military equipment, procurement. The fourth industrial revolution offers some real opportunities for creative change. And we have not done enough, for instance, in understanding how 3D printing can be done to create components. You don't have to worry about interdicted supply chains if you have a series of components in place. Massive increases in computing and AI technology that allow for large numbers of drones, unmanned systems, air, sea, subsurface, even land, which can distribute, which can spread out, which make it harder for a potential or actual opponent to be able to concentrate forces in any one area. And this also then allows for resilience, cooperation to be developed. Finally, and I think this is something else, as Bob has alluded to, NATO has to evolve into the 21st century away from the unfortunate binary that it's locked into, which is there's membership and there's non-membership. And those are the only two. It's a black or white, 0 or 1. Unfortunately, because of what happened in the early 90s when the first conceptions of NATO enlargement were being discussed, you had ideas about associations, about developing partnerships, but because at the time, then Polish President Lech Wałęsa and then Czech President Václav Havel wanted to really push for immediate enlargement of the alliance. Some of those partnership options that were being discussed and developed, particularly in the Pentagon and in the State Department, were kind of set aside, and they didn't get the level of seriousness because the message that was received, particularly after the meetings in Washington between Wałęsa, Havel, and Clinton, sort of suggested that the only options were to be a member, full member, or nothing. As we're going to see in Vilnius, I don't think Ukraine will get a membership nod. It will not get a membership action plan. The alliance has grown, now 31 members. It's much more, it's a much more fractious alliance that still relies on consensus. As we've seen, Sweden is still not a member, despite all the talk that this would happen rapidly. And so NATO and NATO countries, particularly the United States, have to think about differing levels of partnership and association that are not paper, that are not declarative, but which carry with it real areas of security commitment and provision. And if Vilnius sort of does not produce, which I don't anticipate it will not produce a pathway forward for Ukraine. And if a pathway forward for Ukraine is not produced, then certainly one for Moldova and Georgia is not going to follow. Then waiting around for this to happen only cedes the initiative to Moscow, and particularly some of the talk in Vilnius that, well, we can talk about this when the war is over. Then you're sending a signal that as long as the war remains even in a frozen state, that nothing is going to happen, and so what's the incentive to end any of these conflicts? So I think we have to think about some of these things, and I'll end here because in the next panel tomorrow, looking forward, there are ways of thinking which break us out of the binary approach and which could be constructive for helping to assure security in the region.
Thank you, Nick. I think that was a really interesting presentation. I think you gave us a lot of provocative food for thought. So I'm looking forward to the Q&A section of this. Particularly, I'll hold on to the sort of the black and white notion, right? You're either a member or not, because Georgia has been kind of holding on to that in-between space for a very long time. So I'll be interested in what questions we'll get. Let's turn it over to Rick Landgraf, who will now talk about NATO's role in this country and in Ukraine a little bit more.
Thank you. As my slides are coming up, I will follow my two colleagues in offering my own disclaimer that my comments do not necessarily reflect the official position of the U.S. Department of Defense or the United States Army. I want to thank Nick for offering a smooth segue into my comments. I was going to talk about things a little bit more broadly, but I would like to zero in on Ukraine and Georgia's integration with NATO, prospects for membership, and how these two cases represent how multilateral commitments are much more layered than they seem. That on the one hand, NATO demonstrates that it's not a membership or no membership dichotomy, but on the other hand, in many ways, both Georgia and Ukraine are de facto members, and they enjoy many of the benefits and have many of the things that members do have. So I want to talk a little bit about how we can interpret NATO's behavior with regards to integrating Ukraine and Georgia, and how specifically we can think about the Bucharest decision in 2008 at the Bucharest summit, in which NATO pledged that both countries would become members of the alliance at some point in the future, but did not offer either country the practical pathway to achieve that through a membership action plan. And how the Bucharest commitment has developed in some ways as more about avoiding being seen as giving in to Russian pressure and coercion, and less about actually following through on integrating these two countries into the alliance. And for NATO, maintaining this rhetorical commitment to Bucharest is about exerting its own autonomy and exerting its own independent decision-making ability, and promoting and maintaining this open door policy towards membership, which was enshrined in NATO's charter, Article 10, which states that any European democratic state that meets NATO's standards for membership can join the alliance, which is based on really the two guiding principles of NATO enlargement. And the first is the principle of the right of national self-determination. And the second is a maximalist interpretation of state sovereignty. And NATO holds dearly to these two principles, and these two principles are expressed through upholding Article 10, the open door policy to membership. Next slide, please. Okay, so to review a bit and how we got here into 2023, and rewinding a bit to go back to the Bucharest summit of April 2008. Now, this was the first time that NATO explicitly said that two countries would join the alliance. And NATO came to the Bucharest summit without a consensus about how to make this happen. There was a consensus in principle that Georgia and Ukraine should become members, and that they wanted to, since they wanted to become members, but not in practice and how to make this happen. And the way that this happened at the time was the Membership Action Plan, which was an institutional mechanism that was developed after the first round of NATO expansion, which saw Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic join in 1999. The belief was that these countries did not fulfill all of the requirements of membership before they acceded to the alliance. So NATO came up with this mechanism, this Membership Action Plan, to ensure that that didn't happen. So every country that has joined NATO since has first had a Membership Action Plan. And this is until of April of this year, where Finland joined NATO without having a Membership Action Plan first, which adds a whole new dimension into Ukraine and Georgia's integration. So in many ways, the cases of Ukraine and Georgia are very much alike. Russia has invaded both states to prevent their likely accession to the alliance. Both states have territorial fragmentation. They have unresolved conflicts. But one of the big differences in these two cases is that whereas the Georgian government has maintained an official aspiration for NATO membership, the Ukrainian government has not. From 2010 to 2014, the Yanukovych government had declared military neutrality and basically withdrew from the aspiration to pursue NATO membership. So in some ways, the cases of Georgia and Ukraine are very much alike. The geopolitical contexts are very similar, but what is different is how the twists and turns and the various kind of aspirations of the governments. Can you in the next slide, please? And so what I want to offer is a conception of how Ukraine and Georgia make their sales pitch, how they've made their sales pitch to NATO. And in many ways, they followed in the footsteps of the countries that have come behind them. And there's really three pillars to this sales pitch. The first is that both countries are fundamentally part of Europe, that during the time of the Soviet Union, they were ripped away from the West, and since the Soviet collapse, this is an opportunity now to have a institutional homecoming with the West. The second is that these are countries that have embraced democratic values, and Russia's actions represent a threat to democracy, so it's democracy endangered. And the third, and this especially applies to Georgia, is that both countries have fashioned themselves as loyal wingmen to NATO. Georgia has for the size of Georgia's military, it has sent its best troops to support NATO missions across the globe, specifically in Iraq and Afghanistan, and that because Georgia and Ukraine have done these things, because they're a part of Europe, because their democracy is under threat, and because they have been loyal to NATO, that they warrant membership in the alliance. And so we have a situation now where Ukraine and Georgia are distinctive partners. They're special partners. They have a special relationship with NATO. And in lieu of getting what they really want, a membership action plan, which they have been striving for many years, NATO has instead awarded consolation prizes to both countries. And we see this in the various creative ways that NATO has developed the SNGP, the Substantial NATO Georgia Package. The counterpart for Ukraine is the Comprehensive Assistance Package. Both countries are what's called Enhanced Opportunities Partners, which opens up new doors to training and exercises with NATO. And they really show, these cases really show how the commitment that NATO has made is more complicated than a membership or no membership dichotomy. But at the same time, this membership, no membership debate overlooks the critical thing that both Georgia and Ukraine really want, and that's a security guarantee. So whether that's through NATO or through some other way, this is why, in my opinion, Georgia and Ukraine want to join NATO, is so they can gain a security guarantee. And we see this playing out currently with both countries, especially Ukraine. I want to also maybe look at NATO a little bit differently, and I want to introduce a concept of looking at NATO as a robust actor and how NATO is able to follow a robust action strategy with approaching Ukraine and Georgia. And this is a concept borrowed from chess and how chess masters can follow a strategy where they take non-committal actions to achieve short-term objectives while achieving long-term flexibility. And I argue that NATO behaves this way toward Georgia and Ukraine. It maintains a commitment, a rhetorical commitment, and this rhetorical commitment is backed up with tangible action through SNGP, through CAP, through EOP, through the NATO Georgia Commission, through the NATO Ukraine Commission. But these various consolation prizes that are doled out do not really entangle NATO in Ukraine or Georgia anymore. It doesn't commit NATO anymore to Ukraine or Georgia. And this is at the detriment of Ukraine and Georgia. And lastly, I want to offer how Finland and presumably Sweden's accession changes the dimension for Ukraine and Georgia. Because for many years, NATO has said to both countries, both Ukraine and Georgia, that the membership action plan is the next step on your direct way to membership. But NATO has also said that both countries already have all the practical tools to prepare them for membership, meaning that MAP is not a practical tool, and it holds mostly symbolic value. Finland has joined without a membership action plan. Presumably Sweden will join without a membership action plan. But these countries are also already EU members. And Finland has been the first country that has joined EU first and then NATO. Previously, the precedent was the other way because it was believed that the barrier to entry to the EU was much higher and that NATO was more of a stepping stone to EU membership. So what this has done, unintentionally, it has raised the specter of a double standard, that there's one standard for countries like Finland and Sweden, and then another standard for countries like Georgia and Ukraine, but also Bosnia and potentially Moldova. And so this adds a new dimension into NATO integration. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rick. Let's go to Batu, and then I have about 1 million questions for all of you.
Thank you, Maia. So I will try also after so many different components has been covered about the NATO on the on the Black Sea. I would like to focus on a like holistic picture of the Black Sea, how the Black Sea countries, Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, see NATO and NATO membership, especially after February 24, 2022. And NATO's role has been always perceived as an important platform for state modernization. Notwithstanding this kind of an some kind of an apathy or dissatisfaction with proceeding to the membership, especially in Georgia and Ukraine. Now the context is rather different. So even for the NATO, the momentum is rather decisive. We can compare this momentum for NATO to the momentum when Soviet Union dissolved. So, and there was a debate, as you all remember, what NATO gonna do when the major threat is disappeared. And eventually this threat has not disappeared, it just evolved to the new threat or the new manifestations of the same old threat, which we already see is happening. So in that regard, now is a new momentum for NATO, with Russia on its final downturn of collapsing, as the Russia we knew before they invaded last year in Ukraine. That, of course, changes a lot of components for the NATO. Even if we refer to the new NATO strategic concept, the vision of the new NATO is rather a global security organization rather than only regional defense alliance. And it has its merits. It has its merits, and also important component of the statecraft process that NATO supported in those countries, particularly for Georgia. Georgia was the first country in our part of the world who got all the new innovative, let's say, mechanisms, starting from the IPAP, ID, and then now the new mechanism that has been mentioned already. Though we were complaining that these new mechanisms were kind of innovatively created barriers by the NATO bureaucracy not to proceed to the actual membership, because that was the discussion as well, that the fatigue in Europe with the world of membership, the same was the EU, but still it has its very positive effect in terms of the NATO's transformational role for the new democracy. So if now we are considering the global context, which new NATO security concept covers really well, as a democracy versus authoritarianism, then we have a whole new avenue to work with NATO. And that's how Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova perceive Black Sea as a NATO Sea role in the future European architecture. And also another component is that besides NATO, there is no other alternative for the security guarantees. Whether one might like it or not, but this is where it is. So NATO finds itself in this that position of having a role, unique role, that there is no other international formats that can substitute security guarantees or some rules that everyone would have. Therefore, this is a chance for the European Union, as all the European countries or European part of NATO as well, with this discussion of the strategic autonomy. Because if the previous enlargement has been led mostly by the US leadership or US vision of the European and Euro-Atlantic architecture, now the space is wide open for the European vision of the European architecture, not only US imposed. That sometimes, maybe unjustly, but still was considered some kind of an irritational factor in most of the European capitals as well. So, and in that regard, the important component to keep in mind is that NATO, with new strategic concept, again referring to it, has innovative vision or approach of the multi-layer cooperation, which under NATO umbrella includes some regional or bilateral arrangements, which also can provide maybe some short-term solutions of the long-term problem of ensuring or protecting democracies, especially ones who are on this kind of a democratic belt needs to be constructed around Russia. And again, referring back to the democracy versus authoritarianism dilemma, it's important also to keep in mind that the process is not stalled, it's evolving, and besides the military component, Russia has already successfully deployed its network of malign influences of those countries within. And this includes kleptocratic money, corruption, propaganda, informational network that is quite well lubricated by the different schemes of the corruption. So notwithstanding whether it will be sooner or later that Russia will pose a military defeat on the battleground, it doesn't mean that Russia as a threat will disappear in foreseeable future. And when we speak about the resilience of those threats that will be coming from Russia, and it might be changing, it might be some spillover effect of internal problems that Russia might face in the nearest future. One of the key components, of course, is democratic institutions that make those countries on the Russian border resilience. And I think the next task for NATO also is to prove that the democracy can survive and democracy will be protected, notwithstanding it is it has a military might enough to resist or protect themselves, or its economic power. So it's about democracy. So, and in a bigger context as well, we see that the interest of the NATO mechanism is increasing globally. For example, recently was the news that there will be a NATO office in Japan. Yes, it's an important dimension as well to see that NATO interoperability is a unique experience military-wise because it has a lot of content, and Georgia is a good example, at least till now, when with the SNGP and the diversity of programs under the SNGP that can be utilized even much higher extent than it is now, but political interoperability as well. And Ukraine quite successfully proved that these old arguments that we've been hearing before, that defendability of the new members, that was the case with the Baltic countries, we heard it regarding the Georgia as well, and regarding the Ukraine, it's not relevant. Ukraine proved that countries with a resilient civil society, resilient democratic institutions can, in a rapid way, adopt to the new technologies or new doctrines as well. And also that's a good experience for what Ukraine is doing actually right now, being in the war, good experience for other countries around the Black Sea to learn. And this threat of continuous threat of the Russia as a source of instability, of course, includes component that the military power will not be substituted by anything. So there can be no arguments that trade or cooperation with Russia or mutual dependency on energy that was used before to kind of pacify Russia's aggressive behavior will not be relevant if there is no military component or hard power security guarantees. And lastly, and I will stop there, in terms of the strategic forecast and or strategic vision, it's very important to have US security strategy on the Black Sea, and I hope this strategy act will be passed soon, and it will become part of the legislation. In terms of the priorities, I think for transatlantic relations, Black Sea, and it was mentioned, I will not repeat, is getting more and more high priority, and Black Sea is not only just a regional issue. To put it simply, Black Sea is not Las Vegas. What will happen on the Black Sea will not stay in that region and will have a wider effect on everything globally, starting with energy, trade, food security, strategic materials, Central Asia, even China's policy in Central Asia and elsewhere. So it's quite a fulcrum of the new geopolitical order. So the strategy have to include three key pillars. One is a hard security guarantees, immediate guarantees, and eventual membership perspective. Second should be neutralization of other means of the malign influence of Russia and its partner, quote-unquote, authoritarians. So neutralizing the corrupt networks and financial means of influencing the decision-making in the Western countries or particular capitals in NATO. And democracy, boosting the democratic resilience. So NATO actually can serve a maybe even more effective platform for building up or boosting the democratic resilience rather than all traditional other organizations. And with this threefold strategy, I'm pretty sure that Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova will be able to finish the unfinished job of this idea, Europe, whole and free and peace, which was a great idea, but that has been paused on the western bank of the Black Sea. And I think that job needs to be finished. So I will stop there. And lastly, I think in terms of the marketing, labeling of this NATO strategy on the Black Sea, we can borrow it from Nike. Just do it with the enlargement.
Thank you so much, Batu. Gentlemen, thank you for these remarks. So I want to sort of get into the more practical aspects of all of this and see how this sort of applies to real life. So Bob, I'm going to start with you. Wait, before I do that, I just want to make sure we address the elephant in the room. When we talk about security guarantees, Ukraine and Georgia want security guarantees. There's just one place that they want security guarantees from, right? This is all about sort of finding safety away from Russian aggression. So let's make no mistake on that. That a lot of this comes from the fact that Russia is the aggressor in the region. So, Bob, is NATO black and white? Is it membership or no membership? The in between, the consolation prizes, as Rick referred to them. Are they useful or are they more harmful? And also, is this supposed to be maybe a philosophical discussion? And do you actually see a solution in the works at some point? Will it just be as simple as you're either a NATO member or not? And are we ever going to be able to sort of stop having this discussion about, is MAP helpful? Is being called a NATO partner helpful, or is it doing more harm than good? How do you view this?
So, yeah, thanks for the question, Maya. Rick did a great job, I think, of your slide, Rick, with the timeline that sort of showed from Bucharest, April 2008 to where we are now. I think in retrospect, it's clear that the compromise at Bucharest was a mistake, right? And I think, as a general rule, half measures with Russia do not work. So the compromise, which really came down to a U.S.-German disagreement, U.S.-led camp, German-led camp, in April 2008, where the U.S. Strongly supported MAP for Ukraine and Georgia, and the Germans and the countries aligned with them in NATO were strongly against. We came to this split the difference, lowest common denominator compromise, where the summit communique said Ukraine and Georgia will become members of the alliance, but left it unclear when that would happen, and also made it clear to the Russians that in the interim they had no security guarantees from NATO. So since then, NATO has taken a series of steps with both countries designed to build interoperability, right, to make them able to operate militarily with the alliance more effectively, and to give them things that looked like steps toward membership without actually offering them any security guarantees. So I think from the NATO perspective, NATO would say, especially in Georgia, there has not been enough focus on Article 3, right? We fixate on Article 5, which is the collective security part of the NATO treaty, which says an attack on one is an attack on all. But Article 3 also says that NATO aspirants and NATO members need to focus on their own territorial defense capabilities and their own security. And so NATO admitted the Baltics in 2004. That will not happen again. NATO is not going to admit countries that are military liabilities into the alliance. Georgia right now is a military liability to the alliance. Ukraine is not, right? Ukraine has showed that it can defend itself and very effectively. So to my mind, Ukraine and Georgia, which since 2008 have been sort of a tandem moving toward the alliance at different speeds, but always mentioned in the same breath. As Rick said, Ukraine formally under Yanukovych gave up its NATO aspirations and then reasserted its desire for membership after the Maidan. But I think the Ukraine-Georgia tandem is broken probably complete for good, probably irrevocably. Whatever happens with Ukraine at the Vilnius summit, no one is talking about Georgia getting MAP anymore. No one is talking about a path to membership to NATO for Georgia. We're having that discussion with Ukraine because, frankly, Ukraine's democratic credentials are stronger at this point than Georgia's are, and Ukraine has shown it is not a military liability to the alliance. And so, you know, I get there's NATO fatigue here, right? I've been watching this process unfold since 2008, and there are a lot of people in the Georgian government, in the Ministry of Defense and the Georgian Defense Forces that are just tired of feeling like they've done a lot in terms of deployments to Iraq, deployments to Afghanistan, supporting NATO in other ways, building interoperability, and it hasn't been rewarded. But I think there's Georgia fatigue in NATO too. Whatever happens in Vilnius with Ukraine, it's pretty clear that they won't get a membership action plan, and as a couple of our groups said, MAP is no longer the only way to get in, right? I mean, Finland and Sweden will get in without MAP. Finland has, Sweden will. But yeah, I guess, Maia, to summarize, I think the 2008 compromise, in retrospect, it was the best we could do at the time, but it was a mistake, right? It did enough to alert the Russians that we were serious about taking Georgia and Ukraine into the alliance, but it also made it clear to them that they had no security guarantees in the interim. The series of measures we've taken in the interim, in the whatever 15 years since 2008, have been designed to build interoperability and sort of give carrots to Ukraine and Georgia while not giving them what they really want, which is the Article 5 protection.
Thank you, Bob. So I'm going to ask just one more question, and then I'm going to open it up for audience Q&A. So please prepare your questions. I'd love to hear as many of them as possible. But Nick, let me turn it over to you really quickly. What do you hear? What is your reaction when you hear this very specific description of the consolation prize items, right, that Rick laid out very clearly? Do you see them as useful, or do you think these are things that could just be a part of security cooperation between, you know, Ukraine and the U.S. or Georgia and the U.S.? Could these just be outside the NATO framework? Would that make more sense to you from based on your presentation?
I mean, the first thing is, and I'll blame politicians on this, is that politicians are promiscuous in their language, and the promiscuity of politicians in their language creates problems. So let me give you one example. This is not a partisan comment whether or not you liked or didn't like the previous president, but one of the points in the first impeachment of Donald Trump, which was consistently raised, was Ukraine is an ally of the United States. The president has betrayed an ally. This was prominent in the rhetoric, this was prominent in the articles of impeachment that were raised, that the president has stabbed an ally in the back. And, you know, being a literalist that I am, I would ask people, what treaty of alliance are we talking about? I don't recall, they're not in NATO. I don't recall that the U.S. has done a separate Ukraine doesn't even have the status of Taiwan. Taiwan has legislative security guarantees that are written into U.S. law. Ukraine didn't even have that. And yet what did it do is it increased the Bob, I agree with your point about Bucharest, it increased the paranoia in Russia, which, right, the Russians said, see, they're secret NATO members, right, the double secret NATO, and that they're doing all of these consolation prize integration, and see, we're going to end up, right. So one of the things you hear from people like Prigozhin and others is we waited too long, right? We should have finished the job in 2015 because look at what NATO has done in building up Ukrainian capacity. and so Ukraine gets the worst of all worlds, right? So they get tarred with you. Well, you're sort of a NATO member when it's convenient for American politicians to say you're an ally, but then, of course, when you get attacked, then all of a sudden you're not a member of NATO, and it's regrettable. But that, I think, has to end. I think that this kind of back and forth, this is why looking at some of these new security arrangements, but to be explicit about what they commit, what does it mean to have a partnership, a degree of association. NATO doesn't have this, as maybe it should be thinking about a concept of association, that you are an associate of the alliance and you spell out what that means in terms of what you can concretely depend on, what guarantees, what security guarantees that you have. And of course, the U.S. is increasingly facing this with regard to Taiwan as well. Strategic ambiguity can work in some cases, but it doesn't work in others. When it's not clear what you're prepared to do when something happens. Ukraine, I'll push back a bit. I think that, Ukraine proving its value in a defensive way is there, but the problem that Ukraine is facing going forth in Vilnius is not, can Ukraine defend itself? It's the question of, when we talk about Ukraine in NATO, what is the territory of Ukraine that NATO will cover? And that is why Vilnius is not, I think, not happening, because it's one thing to say the territory that Ukraine controls as of June 25th, 2023, versus Ukraine's internationally recognized borders of 2014, and that's the gap. And again,
have you seen that be brought up? Because I think that's such an important point.
It's not, well, again, it's not brought up openly.
Not openly.
And then so then and this is part of the problem about why it's hard to have these open dialogues about it, because people don't want to say that, but that's the subtext of, would we, if Ukraine were to come into NATO with a map, without a map, would it come in? And would we say it, for example, I'm sorry, just as a bit of even further history, when the Federal Republic of Germany joined NATO in 1955, it joined NATO without defined borders. It joined NATO without the final status of the Federal Republic being defined, right? The Federal Republic did not recognize the existence of something called the German Democratic Republic. It said it was the government of all of Germany, and yet it was brought into NATO with a very clear understanding that once the Federal Republic joined NATO, NATO would not be then recovering the rest of Berlin on behalf of the Federal Republic. And that was the status until the treaties of 1970, and then, of course, the final treaties of 1990 regarding, the Federal Republic in NATO. We're not hearing that discussion about Ukraine. If Ukraine were to be brought into NATO, would the treaty apply to Ukraine as a whole, and then it would be suspended for the areas of Ukraine that are not under Ukraine's control? But then, of course, from the Ukrainian side, does this mean that essentially it's a de facto way of saying you'll never recover the territories that you don't already have? And so it creates a prisoner's dilemma for everyone. But we're not even really discussing this in this, and I think that, and then I think, Bob, I think what we end up doing is we create these compromises that are to preserve the unity of the 31 members of NATO. It's the lowest common denominator, but Ukraine gets a vote, Russia gets a vote, and the Russians have exercised their vote now 3 times to the detriment of Black Sea countries over the last 15 years. And that's something that we'll have to face as well.
Thank you so much, Nick. Okay, so I will let our colleagues here decide which questions to take. I think that might be simpler, so thank you.
Hello. Thank you very much for the most interesting panel and the conference. I am Otto Tabons from the Baltic Security Foundation, and so it must follow naturally that I would like to ask a question about the remark on over-focusing on the Baltic region, which perhaps I may not dispute, but certainly I think we could all appreciate that it is not so easy for Russia to, let's say, resupply the Kaliningrad region. But besides that, I think a key aspect here would be the general security of the eastern flank of the alliance, and what perhaps would be some of the points or some of the aspects that we could put our attention to balance this focus, because I would think that some of the points that you mentioned, specifically with regard to the particular capabilities, the cruise missiles, the air defense systems, the infrastructure and cyber, well, those are issues that are relevant also if we talk about the Baltic state and the threats we have from Russia in that part. They're certainly the case also important in the Black Sea region. What could be some of the ways how to make it, let's say, more balanced and a better situation both for the Black and the Baltic Sea region, as I think both of them are very important for the alliance. Thank you.
Thank you, Otto. I think that's a critical point, and it reflects the fact that the alliance has to learn to be able to operate in multiple theaters simultaneously, rather than in some sort of sequential form. And when I mean that NATO over-focused on the region, it's not that there weren't security issues, but it's that when you look at much of what was being done in the U.S. strategic community from 2014 to 2022, it was always the presumption that Russian action would be in the Baltic states. There wasn't a lot of focus on what could the Russians do, even though, Bob, I think as you pointed out, or Maia, that all of the Russian kinetic action over the last 15 years has been in the southern dimension, the Black Sea. And yet we weren't wargaming any, we weren't as much as we should have. And we're all familiar with the famous RAND report about the Baltics and what we would need. And you didn't see sort of similar, all right, what would happen if there would be a strike elsewhere. Part of this also is that the alliance has to shift to, this goes, Bob, thanks for mentioning Article 3, that the stress on Article 3, because that self-resilience of countries and then of groups of countries is going to be critical, because I'm convinced that sooner or later there will be a situation in the Pacific that the United States will be so involved that the idea that then the United States can sort of pivot back to Europe in time is not going to happen. And I don't want to make it sound like, well, you're on your own. There'll always be some U.S. presence here, but the U.S. ability to focus as much on Europe, whether it's the Baltic or the Black Sea or the Arctic or Central Europe or another crisis in the Balkans, is going to predicate essentially a lot on whether or not Xi Jinping decides now is the time to make greater steps. And so that all of this that you've noted there is on the side of resiliency. Backup systems, resilient, the ability to hold the line without saying, well, D10 and then the Americans will show up in force. Because I think that's just simply the reality. I mean, I know that there are some who say, well, the China threat has been overblown and it's not going to happen. I don't know that I want, as an American, that I want to take the gamble that all is well in China vis-a-vis the security situation. And so, yeah, having this so that we can operate in multiple theaters simultaneously. Dov Zakheim, who is a board member at FPRI among his long and distinguished career, is really warning, he has this phrase, Eurasian simultaneity, that we are not prepared for multiple crises happening simultaneously across the broader Eurasian region. We believe we can always target one, and the other ones can just be put on back burners, and he doesn't think that in the world of the 2020s that that's going to be feasible, that we are going to be faced with, right? And then we don't want to be in a position to say, well, to defend the Baltics, we have to write the Black Sea off, or we have to write off something in the Arctic, or we have to, particularly for our Asian allies who are still skittish about this, that will say, well, South China Sea, Philippines, sorry, we're busy in the Black Sea, and you're just going to have to accept Chinese control of the Western Philippine Sea for the time being. So it's that a lot of those recommendations are so that you can function in terms of that simultaneity.
Why don't we go to, let's keep the answers really brief and then go to more questions. Does anyone else want to comment?
Yeah, Otto, I guess I implied also that maybe we over-focused on the Baltics. My point is we under-focused on this region, right? I actually think NATO's response in the Baltics was appropriate. The battle groups are enough to present a deterrence by punishment threat to Russia, but not enough. The RAND study that Nick mentioned, argued for 7 full brigades in NATO. Well, that's an offensive military threat if you're sitting on the other side of the border. It's only 90 miles or so from the Russian border to St. Petersburg. 7 NATO brigades in the Baltic republics it may be a credible deterrence by denial threat, but it's also an offensive military threat to Russia, so it had the potential to escalate the situation. I just think we underfocused. We convinced ourselves that after Russia intervened in Ukraine in 2014, the next place would be the Baltics, and I never thought, the Baltics have never been next. Russia plays by different rules in the Baltics because Russia sees and has always seen the Baltics as part of Europe. They do not see Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova as part of Europe. They see it as part of their geopolitical space, and they play by a different set of rules, and that was sort of my point.
My question is, what are the domestic political costs of consolation prizes instead of promised maps and resulting security? And the second part is there a link between the resulting insecurity and the Georgian government's moves towards Russia and away from the West?
Please identify yourself and ask questions.
Yeah, sorry. My name's Zach. I was just a research assistant for the Eurasia Group Foundation, and now I'm doing some political consulting work.
Just to clarify, domestic political costs for whom?
For countries like Georgia or Ukraine, like when they're guaranteed these or told they're going to get maps eventually, and then they don't. What are the costs there, and how does that then affect NATO overall, if it does?
I think the costs, first and foremost, is NATO fatigue within the populations of Ukraine and Georgia. That these countries are told for a very long time, for about 15 years now, that if you keep working hard, you will earn a membership action plan. But instead of a membership action plan, other things are doled out by NATO, and these are incentives, and they are intended to promote interoperability and intended to get the countries to raise their standards to NATO's membership standards. But at the same time, we have a situation where both Ukraine and Georgia are held to a standard that no other NATO ally has been held to. And advocates for these countries, continuously use the example of countries like Albania or Montenegro or North Macedonia, countries that were brought into the alliance that did not necessarily meet the requirements. In fact, when North Macedonia was brought in, the NATO statement, the official statement, says that we're going to bring North Macedonia in under the auspices that it will continuously work to meet the requirements for membership. Whereas in Georgia and Ukraine, the expectation is that they're already supposed to meet all the requirements and then gain membership. And this creates this double standard that I'm offering. Now, obviously the difference here is that a country like North Macedonia versus Ukraine and Georgia, well, North Macedonia doesn't border the Russian Federation, right? North Macedonia doesn't have territorial divisions. So, so using the argument that a country like North Macedonia was brought in, but the countries like Jordan and Ukraine were not, well, I mean, they're different geopolitical contexts. That's probably not very comforting for ordinary Georgians. And I think another aspect, and I'll end here, is that this idea of EU membership versus NATO membership, and what, for ordinary Georgians, the practical benefits of the EU membership, visa-free travel, education opportunities, employment opportunities, are much more palpable than the benefits of NATO membership. Saying to an ordinary Georgian that you're going to get a security guarantee, well, what does that look like in practice? Versus the ability to travel throughout Europe without a visa. That I think is much more attractive for these populations.
Maia, may I add, as an ordinary Georgian. First of all, I think we all have to admit that in Bucharest 2008, NATO made a strategic mistake, and then not only just not giving membership action plan to Georgia, but also issuing a political commitment without clear mechanism of fulfilling this commitment. And then this caused the procrastination of the particular decisions in the last decade. And this procrastination led to the other mistakes that was the result of the big strategic mistake in Bucharest. And this was a developing or designing policies or patching the problems, but still through Russia prism. So the whatever was the arguments, and it still is about the defendability, democracy standards. The problem with membership was the Russia factor, and some were honest enough to admit that it was about the Russia, but some were trying to cover it up with different arguments. On the other hand, of course, that created a wide avenue for Russia to deploy its hybrid policy towards creating not only military but political anti-access area denial. And that political AAD was covering Black Sea, and that was the reason why Russia moved forward with this ultimatum before invading Ukraine last year, that NATO should retract its decision of Bucharest. It was not that Russia had some understanding that soon this commitment will be implemented, but Russia's goal was to humiliate NATO and to revert back its commitment. And that, of course, additionally created a sufficient ground for Russia to propaganda stunt, which they constructed quite smartly. Unfortunately, but granting or awarding the reset policy after 2008 war to Russia was a kind of a grace period for them to deploy its propaganda stunt, as if the NATO is a problem for Russia, but otherwise you can accommodate some Russian legitimate, quote-unquote, Russian interest. In reality, Russia had no problem with NATO. Russia had a problem with democracy. So in the perception-wise, the understanding was that West gave up with the idea of pushing forward the boundaries of democracy. And within internally, again, in Georgia, we paid the price that we have a pro-Russian government right now, because this type of propaganda stunt really helped Russia to manipulate with the domestic politics as well. On one hand, the fear-mongering, which you hear right now, that West is trying to drag Georgia in the war and NATO equals the war, and the NATO has been disappeared from domestic political messaging or foreign policy of current Georgian government. So, and now when Russia is failing in Ukraine militarily, it's maybe there are some irreparable damage because of the human life cost, but now that's why in the beginning I said now is the momentum to reshape entire NATO approach and correct all the mistakes that been stemmed out from this strategic procrastination of strategic decisions.
Very interesting panel. Thank you very much for this opportunity. My name is Nina Matiashvili. My background is in international business, as much as I have always been interested in international geopolitics, and having lived in the Far East, in the regions such as Hong Kong, Taiwan. So I would like to ask a few questions. One, let's go to Ukraine really briefly. It was mentioned that there are no specific expectations at this time in Vilnius summit. Do you see any time frame, or what would it take for NATO leadership to come up with some kind of proposal for a formal invitation for Ukraine? That's one question, maybe for Mr. Hamilton and Colonel Landgraf. Maybe you could help specify this. Another question is about Swedish membership and ratification. Why is it taking, in your opinion, so much time? And is Turkey playing some kind of political game here? Your opinion on that? And quick question to Mr. Let me see, Nikolas Gvosdev. Thank you very much for mentioning about situation in South China Sea. Do you think that the war in Taiwan is inevitable? Thank you.
So let's try to keep the answers very brief, and then after that we're going to gather a bunch of questions because I don't want us to run out of time.
So on Ukraine, NATO, and the Vilnius summit, Ukraine will get something out of Vilnius. It won't get a path to membership. It won't get a date. It won't get a clear commitment to membership. The only way that would happen is if it were the U.S., a strong U.S. position that this should happen, and it's not. And it's not a NATO leadership, right? As Nick mentioned, NATO is a consensus-based organization, requires 31 national governments to approve the membership of a candidate. So the NATO leadership can want Ukraine in all it wants, but as long as there's even one member who doesn't believe that Ukraine belongs in NATO, Ukraine won't be in NATO.
I agree. I don't think Ukraine will receive any sort of a timeline to membership. There's some talk of perhaps upgrading the NATO-Ukraine Commission to a NATO-Ukraine Council, which would upgrade the relationship, arguably. But it still delays the map issue and doesn't give Ukraine what it really wants, which is a security guarantee. As far as Sweden's membership, I think what Turkey is doing is exploiting NATO's consensual decision-making structure, whereas it takes consensus for membership decisions, and Turkey's probably doing this to extract concessions with regards to military modernization, perhaps. Thanks.
Just briefly on the Turkey thing, I also think, though, this is Ankara saying we're tired of always being told that Northern Europe matters to all of us, but our problems are our problems. And the fact that it's the Kurdish question with Sweden, I think, is telling. I think also it is going to be used as a bargaining tool, but that has been a problem in NATO, and that dates back to 2002, 2003, when we begin to see Turkey start to question whether or not NATO solidarity for Turkey always applies when it relates to Kurds, Iraq, Syria, and then what happened in 2015 wasn't reassuring to the Turks either. War over Taiwan, I mean, wars are never inevitable, but the trend lines are worrying. And for all of the reasons that I actually thought that the Russians would not go full scale back into Georgia, all the economic reasons, interdependence, and yet they did, I think is a cautionary thing that, yes, there's lots of reasons why it's not good for Beijing to try to use force. That doesn't mean that it can't happen and that we have to be, again, decide what we're going to be prepared for.
So we're going to just take a bunch of questions, right? Yeah, because we have about 9 minutes left. So
Thank you.
Maybe let's take 4 questions. Do you know?
I'm Frederick Labar from the Royal Military College of Canada. I'm doing my PhD thesis. How binding are NATO declarations after summits? The reason why I'm asking the question is because at the Bucharest summit, the point 23 from the declaration was saying basically there was actually a mechanism for Georgia and Ukraine to gain MAP. And what was interesting about this is that it depended on the foreign ministers. If the foreign ministers were convinced that Georgia and Ukraine were ready for MAP, then the following phrase from that declaration was that once they would get MAP, they would get accession, which means that, although in the case of Georgia, they've been working since 2004 at least, MAP-like, right? Not only since 2008, but they were working MAP-like since 2004. That means that once the appropriate people are convinced that Georgia is ready, it gets a MAP, it gets admission almost automatically, the way that that declaration is worded. So how binding are the declarations are? And Mr. Gvosdev was talking about the solidarity. If you go back on what you've been saying for the last 15 years, because they have been saying that for the last 15 years, NATO and Georgia and Ukraine will be members of NATO. Georgia and Ukraine will be members of NATO. What kind of message does that send to the opposition if you flip in Vilnius? So these are the two questions I would ask.
For strategic studies and head of USAID anti-corruption project in Ukraine. I have a very practical question when it comes to Article 5. We do have a situation at Zaporozhye plant right now. There's all of the intelligence indicating quite clearly that a provocation is being planned, meaning blowing up parts of the plant and then having a contaminated area in Ukraine that will be a bottleneck basically for military advancement of the counteroffensive, but will have a huge impact for a long period of time in the region. And then Black Sea will be definitely affected by that, including NATO member countries, not just whoever we are, aspirants or consoled or partners, but member countries as well. So what is the position, in your opinion, that NATO should have in this situation? Is Article 5 applicable in this case? And then do you think enough is being done to prevent that from happening based on that?
Maybe one more.
Yeah, I'm Dan Moliniak at the College of William & Mary. My question was initially kicked off by Nick's sort of how to make these areas prickly in the strategy, and a lot of it had to do with sort of specific technological things. Sounds very Eric Schmidt to me. In reality, in the early days of the war, you talk to people at the Pentagon, and they all thought that Ukraine was a liability, right? That things were going to go out very quickly, and the technology that ended up disproving this was, the ability to live stream from Kyiv and show that, the Ukrainians are going to be brave, they're going to be strong. And so that had me thinking, on the one hand, is this really technological, or it is truly a society-based approach? So some of these bigger picture things about what half measures do to society are potentially the most important pieces of this, the ability of these countries to sort of be not liabilities and allies. But secondly, a broader question, 10 years, 5 years after these countries potentially get into NATO, I think what we're seeing with the question over Sweden's entry, Finland's entry, is really one about the 31 allies, and then as they more get in, what their domestic politics look like. So I think of this as two axes. There's the democratic, non-democratic one, but there's also variation on this other metric of sort of solidarity, right? So maybe Hungary and Poland were seen by some Western nations as being similarly democratic in certain ways or undemocratic, but when it came to pushing against the Russians, actually getting some solidarity, they sort of are on opposite sides of this. And so is there any thinking about what Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia would be 10, 15 years from now on that metric, and how that's changed? Thanks.
I'll try to answer the first question about Bucharest summit and the paragraph that was largely neglected later on, that it was deferred to the foreign ministers to make a decision regarding the map. And frankly, this type of gap that has been identified at the communiqué, I think was one of the triggering factors for Russia to invade in Georgia 2008. Because at that time, Russia was behaving rather opportunistically, and till today as well, as a withdrawal from Afghanistan was maybe one of the arguments that was perceived by Russia as an opportunity. So most of the authoritarians are rather opportunistic in their decisions and not having this, 10-year ahead strategic planning. So yes, that gap really triggered, I think, Russian motivation to move forward in Georgia militarily, and I think that that was part of the strategic mistake at that time, considering that later on everyone besides German Chancellor admitted that that was a mistake. In terms of the other commitments in the communique, I think things started changing from 2016 when in Warsaw NATO adopted communique, where first time the paradigm was shifted, and that was the first time in 2016, 8 years after Bucharest, when Russia was mentioned as a threat #1 together with ISIS. But before all the communiques, it was like a bureaucratic rollover or rolling can down the street in terms of repeating that Russia is a partner, Russia is a partner. And of course, it was obvious that Russia was not thinking in the same way about the NATO. That's why I mentioned reset, because mostly even in the European part of the NATO, common argument when we were trying to pitch the Georgia's ambitions to become member country, even with some exclusions on Article 5. The most question informally everyone would ask, okay, what Americans think or do? If they move forward, well, yeah, Europeans will change. So, and in a recent interview, I think 2 years ago, to Deutsche Welle, President Bush also admitted that was a mistake to create this type of gap between a decision and then a possible action. And that's where Russia acted. And also in terms of the Vilnius, and this coupling of Georgia and NATO has been mentioned many times. I think the only circumstance that I will be, as an ordinary Georgian, happy with the decoupling if Ukraine gets immediate membership. Otherwise, this decoupling of Georgia and Ukraine will create another opportunity for Russia to stir up things here.
Okay, I'll try to make this quick. How binding are pledges in NATO communique? As binding as the NATO members want them to be. What happened in December 2008 is that Georgia and Ukraine were not given maps, but they were given annual national programs. Annual national programs is the mechanism what map creates. So it gave Georgia and Ukraine a map without saying Georgia and Ukraine have a map. That's the first point. As far as will become members of NATO, after Yanukovych government withdrew from NATO aspiration, NATO stopped saying Ukraine would become a member of NATO. And it only restarted that after the Maidan and the pro-Western government reinitiated that goal. As far as Article 5 and how this is interpreted, the 2007 cyber attacks in Estonia opened up the door to interpret more than a military-centric view of Article 5. And like a communique, Article 5 is whatever the NATO members say Article 5 is at the end of the day.
Just briefly, to reiterate the point about Article 5, it doesn't commit anyone to do anything other than to consult. It still says armed attack. You can define, and thank you for bringing up Estonia, I also had that down. Is it an armed attack? Is it not? And it's in the eye of the beholder. So I don't think we have a guaranteed response. With declarations, everything else is something that I'll just keep reiterating. Unless the United States passes legislation or the Senate ratifies a treaty, anything else is ephemeral. As Ukraine discovered with Bucharest, as Iran discovered with the nuclear deal, presidents can make lots of promises, and unless it's backed up by binding legislation, it can be reversed, ignored. So I would just throw that out there. Finally, on the solidarity question, I think this is an issue because NATO has the strategic concept that NATO adopted is much more global, much more thinking about global south and global east. And the question is does the center of gravity in the alliance, new members come in, are they as committed to that vision of, hey, we're going to be operating in very other parts of the world, or is it going to be a Cold War era of NATO, which is, as Maia said, there's one strategic threat, and that's the one you focus on, and the other things you don't. And that, I think, is these debates in NATO are temporarily in abeyance because of Ukraine, but they're going to reemerge throughout the rest of this decade.
Okay, well, please join me in thanking our panelists.
And now I'm going to ask panel 2 to join us. We're just quickly going to reset, but not really taking any major breaks. The moderator of this panel is Aaron Schwartzbaum, who is the Templeton Fellow at FPRI. You will see Aaron's longer bio in the bios document, but if you guys are into podcasts, I highly recommend that you check out Aaron's podcast, well, 3 podcasts for FPRI. That's on our website at fpri.org. So thank you again, and we're going to go into panel 2 in just a second.